Ideal Nutrition podcast. As always, my name is Torwen Eerkens and I'm here with my co-host Aidan Muir. Now, we have done previous episodes on caffeine on this podcast before, including caffeine for performance, caffeine and sleep, and generally caffeine questions, misconceptions. But today we're doing a bit of a quick 7 things worth knowing about caffeine.
So we're going to start with caffeine sources and the content of those things. So starting off with coffee, I would typically call a standard shot of coffee around 80 milligrams. We know that this can be hugely variable, but I like to put that out there for context for everything else that we go from here. So energy drinks. In Australia, typically a 500 ml energy drink is around 160 milligrams of caffeine. That's the standard. Most are around that range. So obviously a 250 ml one would be around 80. And then pre-workout often ranges from 240 to 300 milligrams of caffeine, but there's also many scenarios where it's higher or lower than that. And another one is no-dose as well. So like if somebody wants to have like tablets or capsules, like those are 100 milligrams of caffeine.
Soft drinks, a standard can of Coke is about 34 milligrams. And then, of course, we look at tea. So black tea is about 40 to 50 milligrams per cup. Green tea a little bit lower at around 20 milligrams per cup there. Interestingly, other foods can also contain a bit of caffeine. So dark chocolate, small but real, it has about 20 to 60 milligrams per 100 grams. And then, of course, we do have our supplements in terms of things like energy gels, which typically will contain around the 100 milligrams of caffeine.
Yeah, some are quite low, some are like super low, but
yeah.
Yeah. The next one is the half-life of caffeine, which is typically around 3 to 5 hours, but that can vary pretty hugely between people based on genetics and other factors.
What that means is that if you drink a 200 milligram coffee at around 2 p.m, you will still have around 100 milligrams of caffeine circulating in your system that 3 to 7 or 3 to 5 hours later. Genetic variability then is an interesting one when it comes specifically to caffeine. Some people can have a double espresso after dinner and feel completely fine and sleep fine, whereas others will be more wired from having caffeine afternoon, that sort of thing. And this largely does come down to genetics. So the primary enzyme responsible for metabolizing caffeine is in the liver, CYP1A2. Is that how you would pronounce it, Aidan?
I was going to say CYP1A2, but yeah, I don't know. I've only read it. I haven't heard anyone actually say it.
Neither have I. But genetic variants in this enzyme specifically mean that some people are fast metabolizers who clear caffeine quite quickly, whereas others are slow metabolizers who keep caffeine in their system for much longer. Another gene that we look at then is ADORA2A, influences how sensitive your adenosine receptors are to caffeine, meaning that some people feel less dramatic effects and others will have an anxiety response.
You can test for this in Australia. My understanding is you can do it for around $100. There's like direct-to-consumer tests, and often they will test a bunch of other genes alongside this. But this is one of the most clear-cut. It is what it is. Like you test this genes, you get the results. It's very clear this is an accurate way of testing it. But it's also up to you whether it's worth testing, or you could just use your best judgment. I do think there's a lot of people in this world who believe they're quicker metabolizers who might not necessarily be. But I think many people, particularly if they believe they're more sensitive, are probably right. So I don't know. There's a lot to go with that, but it's up to you whether it's worth testing that.
So the mechanism, how does caffeine actually work? So when you're awake, your brain accumulates a molecule called adenosine, and it's a natural byproduct of cellular activity. What it does is it binds to receptors in the brain and it progressively signals fatigue. So the longer you're awake, the more adenosine builds up and the sleepier you feel. Now, caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors, so it doesn't actually give you energy. It simply prevents the adenosine from delivering that fatigue signal. And this results in that increased alertness, reduced perception of effort, fatigue, and improved focus.
The next one is training. So we're going to talk about what I'll call 2 different dosages here. So 1 to 3 milligrams per kilo of caffeine can help with making you feel more alert, making it so that things feel easier. We call this reducing the rate of perceived effort. And in some cases, that can help indirectly improve performance. But then higher dosages like 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo, and particularly at the top end of that, so 5 to 6 milligrams per kilo, there are direct improvements in performance. So the mechanisms related to that are kind of complex and varied and debated a little bit, but some of them include central nervous system changes, which allow more motor unit recruitment, stronger muscle contractions, and also potential changes in fat versus carb utilization. As I said, some of those are subject to debate as to whether they matter, whether they're cause for this improvement, but the performance improvement is still consistent.
And specifically for training, like timing does matter. So peak caffeine levels in the blood normally occur approximately that 30 to 60 minutes after ingestion. So dosing at the right time before exercise makes sense if you're taking it at that high of a dose for training purposes.
And one reason why I mentioned the gels, how there's gels that have like lower amounts of caffeine, that's more just for like a top up, because you do the numbers on that 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo and you're like, why would a really low dose gel help with this? But research still does find like low doses during longer bouts of particular endurance activity still can help improve performance too.
For sure. Sleep. Most people do understand that caffeine directly before bed is not the best idea. Gardner et al. Did a 2023 meta-analysis that specifically examined the effect of caffeine on subsequent sleep, and it found that caffeine consumption significantly reduced total sleep time, sleep efficiency, and it also increased the time it takes to fall asleep. And that effects were more pronounced the closer you had caffeine to bedtime. So overall, caffeine reduced total sleep time by about 45 minutes and sleep efficiency by 7%, which is that's a fair amount.
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge. Then the last thing that we'll talk through, so point number 7, is anxiety and the impact that caffeine has on it as well. So we know that caffeine can upregulate anxiety if it's already present. It can worsen symptoms. L-Theanine, we're just going to talk about very briefly, can sometimes offset some of the upregulation of caffeine as well. Like, it doesn't do anything to blunt some of the effects, but it can like reduce an elevated heart rate. It can reduce jitteriness and help with focus and some of these things as well. There's a lot of research on this, but from the caffeine perspective, and an anecdote that I'll tell is I used to work many years ago with almost exclusively veterans who almost all of them had PTSD and anxiety as part of that, and medication for anxiety as part of that. And many people have been on medication for 10, 20 years, so to speak, or about 10 to 20 years. And many of those were also having like 5 cups of coffee a day. And in some cases, definitely not all, obviously, going down to 0 cups of coffee, medication was no longer needed. There's so many factors in that. There's so many multifactorial aspects. There's the fact that it had been 20 years since they had been on the medications and stuff like that. Were they as needed now as they were at the start? Was this masked a little bit by the caffeine? Was it the fact that they'd also never tried coming off of the medication? This was the first thing that prompted it. There's so many things that go on with that. And there's also many cases where significantly reducing caffeine wouldn't have made that much difference either. But it is something that I do think is worth trialing. And if not completely cutting down to 0, I would say reducing is something that's worth trying as well. And another thing that I would chuck in there is going from a high amount of caffeine to 0 is a grim process in many cases. And something I heard on a podcast once, I was like, this is like, it's so simple, but this is something that's worth chucking in there. They just mentioned, like, if you're going to do it, like, have some Panadol, because like the headache is the worst symptom if you were to do that. So I would definitely add Panadol if you were to do that. Another way of doing it is just like cutting down very slowly, but some people would prefer to just do it all in one go. So it's up to you if you were to go down that route.
I think because it's so highly individual, it's worth doing some sort of testing to see where your tolerance is. If you notice that you're getting more anxious and jittery and your heart's racing a little bit too much, potentially your dose of caffeine across the day is just a little bit too high. So just reduce it and try and see how you feel instead.
Incredible. Well, we will wrap up. This has been episode 262 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. As always, if you haven't already, if you could please leave a rating and review, that would be massively appreciated.